So we're back to talk about Datastar. It's still the beta. We had a second release with some really quite minor quality of life improvements. We added data on interval and we added some minor improvements, minor changes. Not much to write home about, but this is a good sign, right, Delaney? Like this kind of tells me the API stabilized, the rate of change has reduced dramatically, and now we're kind of just smoothing out the, well, I don't know if I'd even call them rough edges, but we're just smoothing things out, giving people time to update their code, start using things in production, hopefully, and report any bugs. And I don't know. I mean, things are going well, I would say.
Yeah, it's really nice that the beta, technically, we could be at V1 because these are all basically new features. Like these are new things that say, hey, people are actively using this in their productions. It would be great if we could do X and Y. It's not anything that's wrong with the V1, which is pretty exciting. Like that's really where we want to be. If I was a if we were less risk adverse, I would be like, okay, this shows us that V1's done, but we still have things to do around documentation and the website and all that stuff. So, like, it's good to stay in the beta, but really, this is just a good sign that like we called V1 at the right time. I think.
Yeah, and V1, like when we decide to release the stable version, it's important because of semver, right? Just to clarify, semantic versioning. So we're saying once 1.0.0 stable drops, no breaking changes. Of course, we can add features, we can make incremental changes perhaps, but nothing that will actually break the existing API. So everybody's apps will continue to work indefinitely, or that's the idea at least. And something to note is that we've added some features and the library has maybe grown by what, 3-4 kilobytes, something like that. Not kilobytes.
No,
Oh, how dare I?
yes, how dare
Bytes.
you? Yes, if a few hundred bytes, and yeah, it's kind of interesting that there was a podcast a little while back. I think HTMX Labs or HX Labs, they did a thing where I had Carson on. And he's like, "Yeah, I really wish I could get HTMX down to around 15K. Like he felt like that was a good number, but he just wasn't sure if he could do it." Um, so we've been hovering right around between 12 and 13, back and forth, and we just hit 13 again, 13 kilobytes. So we still have way more room than even the libraries in the space, but uh, I'm okay with that because we keep adding features, we keep making it easier on people, and it's still smaller than any of the libraries in the space, and it's a full framework. And the nice part is because the bundler's built in, you can pick and choose. You can get it down to 4K, and even if you're saying I just want to merge fragments, I think that's 9K. So like it really depends on what you're using. The nice part is it's still small enough right now that we don't have to have a framework version and a library version, and we say these ones are canonical and these ones aren't, and for best usage, use these things. We can just include all of them. So as long as my thing right now, until we get to the point where we're over 15K, I'm just going to include every plugin. I don't really care, because we could do some code golf to make it smaller, but it's fine. I'm pretty happy with where it's at. So
Yeah. And if we're being honest, most websites are including tens or sometimes hundreds of kilobytes of
or
JavaScript.
megabytes of JavaScript in your first load.
Yeah. This keeping the file size low is important to us. Why? I would say it's important to us because we don't want to have a bloated library. We want Datastar to be as powerful as possible in as few lines as code as possible. And as we discussed last time, reading the source code, the TypeScript, you really get to know how every character counts. And um, what I've noticed is, as we've been making small incremental improvements, every now and then I'll find some legacy piece of code that was like there maybe from one of the previous versions. We get to take that out, and that's why the code kind of just fluctuates, but doesn't really get bloated, which is very important to us.
Yeah, and it's really nice. Even the set interval and stuff, that we'll get kind of into why we added that in a little bit. But the nice thing is that we're just making things declarative. Like all set intervals doing is the same thing that you would do with a set interval timeout in JavaScript. Like that's normal. But really, Datastar's whole point is to say, hey, it should be nice if this was declarative and that I could run this from any backend and I could make it nice tools to drive this in a different way. So the whole point is most of the time there's only so many things. Like we didn't have a set interval and we didn't have a set timeout. We added those. Like that's the major feature of the beta was, hey, we're gonna make these things declarative. That's it. Like nothing else has changed. So yeah, that's pretty good news. It also, things are getting better. People in the community are starting to help out in a lot of different ways. There's been a couple of situations that I was not handling correctly, and I've never handled correctly when it comes to creating expressions. And Anders, one of the people in the community, has been deep at work on making that better. So that will mean that we'll have to drop a beta 3 for sure, because his things are fixing things that have been in Datastar from the beginning. But it's around when you're creating expressions, you can do crazy multi-line things that JavaScript is bad about returning expressions. It doesn't have intrinsic returns. So there's a bunch of things that he fixed that I basically didn't. Like I just, it was like, I'll deal with this on a case by case basis. But he actually did the real work. So we're very thankful that people are actively trying to help make the library better and more responsive. So that's awesome.
Yeah, and just these are pretty low level things in the library, like library level work that most people will never even know about or um, will ever be exposed to. But it's good that we have people actively working on those. So, in terms of like what our focus is, or I'll speak for myself, one of my focuses at the moment is doing a push for the learning materials. I feel like our documentation is in a good place. Um, we have reference guides as well. They're in a good place. I'm not saying they're perfect. We have had valuable feedback from people saying that the getting started guide, for example, is pretty signals heavy initially. Again, I think we'll get into that in a few moments because we want to talk about when you should reach for signals, in what scenarios, and this kind of thing. But in terms of doing a push for learning materials, I put out a PR and an issue that everyone's welcome to check out in terms of creating how to guides. Currently, oh, and this is inspired by someone in the community actually shared this link. It's an approach to writing documentation called Diátaxis. I'm trying to say that as phonetically as possible as I'm reading it. I'll actually link to it wherever we end up posting this. But essentially, this kind of structures documentation in a way that promotes learning, and it kind of divides it up into four pieces. They have a nice visualization, which I recommend everyone just go take a look at because it's a very interesting approach. Anyway, they talk about cognition versus action. I feel like on the cognition side, we've done a lot of explaining and we've got our reference docs, for example. But on the action side, we're kind of lacking in terms of tutorials and how to guides. We have a bunch of examples on the site that show various ways of doing things. But what they're lacking is the kind of taking you through the process of, a goal oriented process of here's this thing that I want to achieve, and here's an explanation of how I might get there. So the push that we're doing at the moment is developing these how-to guides. And in my mind, they will replace the examples because the examples will eventually be integrated into those how-to guides. So one of the examples might be, well, there are quite a few, but we have an example just called polling, right, where we could just show polling, and we're going to talk about this shortly. But that example might turn into how to poll on the back end at regular intervals, right? And then we might set up like a scenario, and this is the goal of the scenario, and here are the steps that you would walk through, kind of like a recipe, and talking through the more kind of fine-grained details of what should be considered and in what scenario should I take one or another approach, rather than just a kind of inlined example. Here's how you do it, boom, and no explanation really given about the nuances of how you might want to get there.
Well, and a
So
lot of this is actually my fault, I will say, from the very beginning, because one of the situations, it just comes from my the road that got us to Datastar, in that it started as an HTMX thing to make it into plugins and all that. The the problem is that when I've started setting up documents, I wanted to know what was different. Why would I use this over HTMX? Why would I use this instead of Alpine? Like, what are the unique features that make Datastar special? And I just started like, those are the things that people need to know right away. But seeing the community start to build up, I'm seeing that that's not most people's vibe with it. They're like, how do I start from the beginning and how do I structure things? And they don't care about what's unique to Datastar. They just want to have, a recipe and to know, okay, here's the canonical way to build things. And so that's my fault, is much more than anyone that's been working on the documentation, because that was where my head was like, just tell me the unique stuff and I'll figure out the rest. So that's not helpful to most people. So sorry.
Well, I think we've seen an evolution, right, in terms of what kind of questions are being asked. Previously, it was like, what is Datastar, or how should I even think about it? How should I use it? And now it's more like, how do I do X with using Datastar? And or it might be like, I figured it out, but I'm not sure I'm doing it the right way. It would be great to be able to compare this against a how-to guide that can kind of show me, am I doing it right? Are there improvements I could make, or are there considerations I should think about as well? So we're actively working on the documentation, and please, if anyone is struggling or has questions, come and ideally contribute as well. We need this push to be community driven, because it is a big push to develop these how-to guides. But come take part, be involved. We'll help you along the way. We don't expect people to come and be able to just write documentation like that, but we do need community support for this. So one of the big topics, or the topic for today, Delaney, we're calling it. We're saying Datastar is the hypermedia framework, but we're also calling it a progressive performance framework. So I think there's a lot to unpack there. Do you want to kick it off with what is a progressive performance framework, and why are we thinking of Datastar as one?
Sure, absolutely. So one of the things that is a very much we've talked about before in the last podcast, and especially in the channel, the Discord channels and stuff, of a lot of learning Datastar is unlearning some of the things that you've gotten used to. One of the things that feels really weird at first, but it gets better over time, is that one of the fastest things you can possibly do with a hypermedia framework is just send down big chunks of XML strings, basically XML, HTML strings down to, and let the browser turn those into DOM elements. It feels very counterintuitive to, instead of be sitting down JSON and then processing it and only rendering parts of it, most of the time, just dumping big strings is really the fastest thing. So what we've been seeing is, I tend to use Datastar only with a few tags, and I just put big chunks of data down. I like instead of, a lot of time people will append things to a table or rebuild, or like add things to a list. I just send the whole thing down again. And the reason why is because I can guarantee that I can update parts of the other classes or CSS. I like, there's so much more that I can do. I have a talk at Utah.js where I talk about immediate mode, where I can just think of it as one big chunk. But if all of a sudden I'm seeing something on a performance graph saying, hey, I'm updating the whole page and only this one indicator is changing, well, then I can say, okay, I'm going to focus on that one indicator, and I can get progressively more performant. But then my mental model has to get more fine grained as well. So it allows you to do, most of the time, you can do these big, huge swaths of changes on the DOM elements with thousands of DOM elements, and it's just a non-issue. It's like in the microsecond level for the update to happen. That's, I think, way easier as a mental model. So people are so used to having to deal with the JSON and deal with React and deal with like so much. If you just flood the page with a bunch of VDOM, it's going to be slow. Like React can't keep up. It just can't. Whereas this way, you're just sitting down the equivalent of the first page. The irony is, most of the time when people are talking about first page paint, they're trying to get as much done on the server, hydrate down from there, because that's the fastest thing, is that first paint from the server. Well, that's what every paint is in Datastar. So it's actually a lot easier to be performant day one. And then if you need that fine grained enhancement, do it. But most people should not be doing it. They just don't need to until they can show me in their metrics and their flame graphs that it's actually a problem.
So let me pause you there, and let's break that down, because I think I get what you're saying, but I want to break it down for people listening. So the way I understand it, or the way I can think of this is, let's say you have 100 items in a list of things, and you take some action, you click a button, something goes up to the server, and we're going to change one of those list items. You're kind of saying, rather than start with like a fine-grained approach where you just figure out what that one list item is and you change that out, you're saying just send down a list of 100 list items again and let the browser figure out the rest. Is that
Generally, yes,
it?
because usually, like, let's say you're editing the page. Well, all of a sudden, you went from doing divs to doing input, right? So now
Mhm.
you've changed that. There, the context of what's available might have changed underneath you. So by just updating that one element, there's other things on the page that could have changed. There's so many things that you have to start thinking about when you get into real world apps. Like if you're just doing a quick little to do example, does not matter. You could do like the fine grained thing; it's going to feel the same. But when you get into real world apps, the world's changing around you all the time. I deal with things that are thousands of events a second, sometimes into the like 100,000 events in a second, and the world's changing on you so fast. It it doesn't. All that matters is the current moment.
Right. So it's kind of like a macro update rather than a fine-grained update. You're saying don't be too smart about it initially at first, right? Like you can progressively, and that's why we're calling progressive performance. You can progressively get more fine-grained, but don't be too smart about it. Send down the whole thing, and because the browser is very good at what it does, which is rendering HTML, let the browser deal with the performance of that, which it is very fast, right?
Yeah, and not
So,
just that, also like even when it comes to the actual fragments you're sending down, it may look like a bunch of stuff, but guess what? If you have a big table of data, that's going to compress really well. Like that, the
right,
browsers are like the whole infrastructure of hypertext media is built around these kinds of big dumb pieces of text. Like they're good at that. Let them do that. If you're going to embrace hypermedia, just let the browser do what it's good at.
right. And when those fragments get merged into the DOM, it's not just swapping in the whole thing, right? That's where Idiomorph comes in. So why is that a key component of Datastar?
Sure. So one of the things in the Datastar SSE plugin, again, everything in Datastar is a plugin. So this is just my take on it. I think Carson Gross from the HTMX world did a really smart thing with this thing he did called Idiomorph, which basically means that if you have the same ID in a merge fragment, it's going to update and morph that element instead of just completely replacing it. And what that means is that you can have the same focus, you can be at the same scroll spot, you can have all those indicators that allow you to treat it as exactly the same element because it technically is. And that allows you to do these coarse grained things, but what then you're allowing Idiomorph to do is to take care of that fine grained stuff at the ID level. And since in Datastar everything has an ID, if you don't have an ID on something, we add it for you automatically, and everything has a ID based off of the tree structure. If you don't give us one, then we can do some really smart things with updates. So even if you're thinking coarse grain, it's handling it for you. It's almost like a React VDOM, but there's no VDOM. It's just updating in place because it already knows what's like the parts that have changed. So we're relying on Idiomorph to do that. And I thought that was a smart thing. Like Carson did some smart stuff. I'm going to take the parts that work and just make it so that it's pluggable. That's all I really want.
Right. So essentially, just to go back to that example, you send back a whole list of results. Only what has changed since the previous render will get morphed into the DOM. That's why we're calling it a morph merge. You can override that behavior, of course, but by default, Datastar will use Idiomorph, which does that morphing for you. So it's almost like you get the benefits of fine grained control without having to bother with it because Idiomorph deals with it for you.
Well, and the thing that I found that was really interesting is I would do thousands, and in fact, in the 3D engine thing I was doing, where I was using web components, I was sending down thousands of elements per page that were changing constantly, and it just worked. And I was like, okay, that's ridiculous. Like, I didn't think that. I thought that would be really dumb, and it wouldn't work, and it works. Like most of the time, it's going to work. Start with the dumb thing that's easy, and the reason why we're saying dumb is because you're just sitting down these big blocks. But the trade off is, yeah, you're sending a few more bytes, but again, it compresses well, but your cognitive load is way down here. As you get more and more fine grained with your updates, you have more and more cognitive load that you're adding to yourself that you have to keep track of things. So I like to be as dumb as I can be, as much as I can be. So send big chunks and then I don't have to worry about keeping state. The hardest thing in computing, like people talk about caching and off by one errors and like that. I think it's making sure two things are in sync. That's the hardest thing in my mind, which is a kind of a form of caching. Because you have
Yeah.
this temporal element that you can never keep things exactly the same. It's a different point in time. So trying to keep those things updated is a nightmare. So just sending a brand new memory of what it is much easier for me to get my head wrapped around.
Yeah. It also results in the possibility of reducing the number of endpoints you have, depending on how you set things up, of course. But you have one endpoint, one thing that you're sending back, and you're just allowing the browser to handle that morphing for you. So far, it sounds like it's kind of like the HTMX approach, except that we're including Idiomorph. Um, and we internally talk about this. I call it 90-10 rule, or you've described it as HTMX gets you 90% of the way there. So let's talk about that last 10%. When should you reach for that last 10%? And what does
Yes.
it look like?
It's weird because I think that the doc when we talk about signals, that's the cool feature that I think was definitely missing from HTMX's workflow. But your code should basically look like a endpoint that's very much like HTMX. Like you go do something, you send back a big chunk of the framework. It's only when you start to do stuff that is client side state is where I think that you start to add signals. Um, so if you have a form and you're updating something, or you have something that has to go into local storage because they can go offline, or if you have something that is dynamic depending on the class that's on, like you have an animation on the page that's dependent on what class is available, and that like those kinds of things that are client side state, that's when you grab for signals. But when it comes to the way that you normally think about things in a React way of like, hey, I have all this state on the front end. Almost never should that be there. The example you'll hear me always go back to is a bank website. There should be
Mm-hmm.
basically there should be no signals on any page until you say, I want to transfer money. And then guess what? The signal is, here's what I want to transfer. Here's what it's from. And the people don't even know what bank account they're going to or anything like that. That's all lives in the back end with a cookie, all that stuff. They have no idea. They just know that the input has a signal and that's going to get attached. There should be nothing else on the page. So, and just to caveat that, there are times when you're doing like real time chat or doing something like that where you're like, hey, I want to push data to a signal. But that's a kind of a higher end thing of like when you want to have some real time reactivity. But most of the time, when it comes to a normal CRUD like page, there should be maybe 4 or 5 signals in your entire app at a time. Um, very much, I believe TurboTax is a terrible company, but it does some great UI stuff, and they tend to put no more than 5 to like I think at the most 10 inputs on any page, and that's the entire U.S. tax code. So I think that it's the same kind of thing in Datastar. If you have more than like 5 or 6 signals, you might want to think about like structuring your app in a better way.
Right. So from what I'm hearing, when we describe Datastar, we often start off talking about signals and how Datastar makes signals declarative and all of that. But really, that's what differentiates Datastar, or it's the kind of secret sauce. What we should be doing is thinking about hypermedia first. Uh, Anyone who's familiar with HTMX, that is the approach you should be using for the most part, merging fragments back into the DOM. Signals are there for the client side state. In other words, when a user is interacting with a page or with a form, that's when signals come into play. They get sent to the backend by default. The backend then is aware of what's happened or what's changed on the front end based on the user interactions, and then can react to that. And it can react to that and you're saying primarily merges fragments back into the DOM, and if it needs to, it can also update those signals accordingly.
Yeah, and one thing that is comes up quite often, and just make sure people are aware of, is that by default, if you are sending down a merge fragment and it has an ID, we will automatically use that ID. So you don't have to do the equivalent of selector or target or anything like that. You basically say, you put an ID in your fragment, we're going to update that ID. And if you don't put any kind of merge mode or anything like that, we're going to use morph. And 99% of the time, that's what you should be doing. The only time I ever don't do that is if I'm appending to a list. And like we've talked about before, almost never should you be doing that either. Like try it by just sending the whole thing down, see what that gets you, and see what your performance numbers are before you start making changes. So the irony is that we want people to do less with Datastar. Like just use the defaults, and you'll get. I guarantee you're going to get there. It's going
Yeah.
to be easier.
I feel like we've very much taken anti SPA stance in that we're saying don't put state in the front end, right? Like the back end is the source of truth for state, and the front end can modify that state, but it's temporary, it's ephemeral. everything should go back to the back end to verify that source of truth, to refresh what is going on in the state of the world, if that makes sense. So signals are very much there to add that front end reactivity that HTMX lacks. So in other words, that last 10% that HTMX does not give you is what Datastar adds in a cohesive solution. But what's also noteworthy, I think, is that that last 10%, you describe it as it's 90% of the work, because you have to deal with that, right? If you don't, then you're stuck with this kind of, okay, we can send fragments back to the front end, but we get no front end reactivity. So that's the
Well, and
difficult
that's the
part
thing
that
that people run into
Datastar
all the
solves
time.
too.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
100%. That's what people run into. If you go to the HTMX Reddit, like I would say about a third of the thing is, how do I add Alpine? How do I add reactivity? How do I deal with this local state? Do I have to write JavaScript here? Do I have to? How do I inject it? Like those are all the questions that are being asked of people building HTMX in production with real apps, and that's the part where you spend all your time, because that's actually where your front end the front end logic is. Like you can't get rid of that unless you're going to do progressive enhancement and you're just going to say, I'm just going to make a static form. That's the only time when you can avoid this completely. And most apps are not okay with that. Like that is not the kind of reactivity that people want. If you want to make a static site with some forms, then you should do that. Like there's nothing wrong with that. But Datastar is built for like building everything from CRUD up to real time dashboards and games and all that stuff. Like we can do all those things, and you learn one way to do it, and it works everywhere. So I'm very much of the like part of hypermedia is the scripting component. You just want to reduce that as much as possible and make things as declarative as possible. I think that's where you really win in general.
So there is this tendency, and I'm guilty of this too, to over rely on signals. To say, well, why would I go to the back end for this small little interaction? Why don't I just, show hide something? Or why don't I just turn this piece of text into a text input field, so that we can switch from read mode into edit mode? How do you think about that? Because I've had that issue. I've ran into that, and it took time for me to unlearn that if I do that, then I'm assuming that the current state of the world has not changed in the meantime. In other words, if I turn a read value into a write value, I'm assuming that nothing's changed on the back end that would prevent me from doing so. Whereas I've kind of become accustomed now to going to the back end every time I need to update state on the front end. So how would you address people who are over relying on signals for doing stuff in their apps?
So one of the stories I really like in game development, I have friends that worked at Blizzard and stuff, and when they were first doing Diablo, it was literally a turn-based game. People that don't know, it was almost like XCOM. It was a turn-based dungeon crawler kind of setup, and what they did is they just took the timer and went to zero. Like they went from the idle effect, the timeout time, the action time down to zero. And they're like, oh wow, this like really plays well. And the whole thing is that if you are thinking in a game developer mindset from the beginning of like, I only have 10 milliseconds roughly to do something interesting in, and then that information is now gone. It does not matter now that I get the next 10 milliseconds. That's all I get. Like you have to think in these tiny
Mhm.
windows of time to do something fun and interactive. Even if you're doing a CRUD app, if you have the mental model of I have this moment to do what I need to do, and then I have no guarantees of what else is going to happen in the next frame, that is the right mental model. Because if you think like that, now all of a sudden you can do a CRUD app that can scale to tens or hundreds of thousands of people and do it on a single server, and it just works. So if you have that right mental model from the beginning of the world's going to change on me, this is only temporary state, it changes the whole way you look at it. And some people are in scripting languages or have a single threaded backend, and they may have 300 or 400 milliseconds of time to go between the server and the front end. I think that's a backend issue. That's a problem, but I think you have to be smart. Just like a game developer, if you know you have a 300 millisecond latency, guess what I'm doing? I'm putting some indicators and doing some animation to make that and making the default 300 milliseconds based off of my timings and metrics, and saying, hey, I'm going to make everything this nice, smooth animation everywhere. Do a slide in, slide out. Guess what? A 300 milliseconds slide in looks pretty good and doesn't feel slow. And that will hide those things. Part of being a game developer is being smart. And most people say it's a hack or it's cheating. No, that's just what development is of a UI. You're trying to make it feel smooth and snappy. And if you have problems in your backend, those are still problems. The problem is the problem, as Mike Acton would always say. Like, if you have a problem in your game engine, you need to fix the game engine, or you need to work around that with your art and other things. So I think the game developer mentality has helped me a ton. I'm not a JS developer at all. I try to avoid it. So game mentality is definitely where my head's at. I don't know how that affects you though. I don't know if that's really helpful because I know you're on the other side. You're like a PHP guy. You don't think of things in 10 milliseconds or in microsecond timings, right? Like that's not your mental model. So I want to know what you think because like my way works. I just don't know if it works for everybody.
Right. So latency is a fact of life. Like you're going to get, over geographic distances, you're going to get a latency of 30, 40, 50 milliseconds that you cannot avoid, right? Now, I believe anything under 100 milliseconds feels instantaneous. So if you're under that, you're probably fine. Anything over that, you probably do want to introduce view transitions or a loading indicator. Um, I think a lot of people assume that things need to be instantaneous, otherwise they feel slow or laggy. But as we've seen, like work on applications with Datastar, you add a CSS transition and it just feels as smooth as butter. Is what I was trying to say. It didn't come out as smooth as I wanted it to. Uh, or you add an indicator, and an indicator they're all over the place. I mean, this like you open any app on your phone, it's not instantaneous, even if it's native app, right? It's going back up to some server, it's talking to the source of truth, it's checking what your status is at the moment, and there's either a loading indicator or there's a logo or there's some sort of placeholder that's telling you about that. I feel like a lot of people, like you say, they overcompensate for uh, the latency of going back to the back end and think, well, let me just use signals, or let me use an optimistic UI approach. And my problem with that is that you're you're not telling the truth. Then you're telling somebody this thing was saved when it was not yet, and then maybe if there's a problem, you come back and you say, "Oh, sorry about that. It actually wasn't saved. There was an error."
Well, here I think I get what you're trying to say, and I think the main issue is part of this is just my experience has been in kind of high risk situations. So dealing with medical stuff or military applications or like slot and poker game auditability, those kinds of things. And you never want to tell someone, hey, the cash out happened and it didn't happen, right? Like there's legal
Yeah.
ramifications for lying to someone in those situations. And the thing is, people talk about optimistic concurrence or optimistic UIs, but getting that I'm working on it, Snappy, which is built in fetch indicator, all those kinds of things. That's important, but not lying to the end user is something that
Yes.
I will not compromise on. I think that people that do this in the React and the spa world of just like, hey, I've already updated this and then roll back basically. I think that's just a straight up lie. And part of that comes from you have to wait till the entire response is done before you can tell that person if it's finished. If you do the SSE style where you can start sending down like, hey, I'm in this part of the process, then it feels nice and snappy. It feels better because you actually know what's going on and you're never lying to the person. I will take someone that never lies to me and yet still feel snappy over someone that's lying to me and yet but it's local. I don't know. This doesn't even make sense to me. It's a false dichotomy to say you can't be snappy and still do all the same things. Like that person in the spa world still has to go to the server. Like they still have the
Yeah.
same latency, and if anything, usually it's a lot higher because you're not getting that initial. Like we can start updating immediately and start sending on data immediately, whereas they have to wait till the entire response. So it's actually snappier than they're feeling.
Right. So I want to highlight that because I think that's something that people overlook, right? That's the power that server sent events gives us. It's an event stream. That means that unlike a regular request response, the response doesn't have to be complete and then sent down back to the client. We can start sending things straight away. So for example, I'm booking a flight somewhere, I enter my credit card details and I say buy now. Yes, we can start a spinner off, but we can also give people indications of what's happening. We've communicated with your bank, we were processing the payment. We can do all of that with SSE, and there's no magic happening. It's just this longer lived connection. And I guess that is a nice segue into the next piece that we want to talk about, which is long lived connections. Even in a language like PHP, where we don't want to draw out the length of that connection, it should be an open close. It is possible with something like that example I just gave to start streaming that response, and it might take 5-10 seconds, and that's okay. But as soon as that's done, as soon as the process is completed, at that point we can close the connection. So I think that's a really important. I would say that's one of the superpowers that Datastar gives us, simply through using server sent events. There's no magic there, but we're able to stream responses rather than just do one single response at a time.
Yeah, and this comes out of like actively using HTMX. I think HTMX was really smart, but I think that there's some defaults that were just wrong. And the problem is they can't go back now. So, for example, the OOB out of band
Out of band.
updates, when you can do updates anywhere, well, why wouldn't I choose that? Why wouldn't that be the default? Why do I
Yeah.
have to go through this like process where I have to tell my template language where and how I want to update my system? The problem is now you're putting, even though it's a backend uh, technology and templates, you're putting your state in your front end. Why are you putting state in the front end? HTMX puts extra state in the front end. I don't understand that. It doesn't make sense to me. Same thing with the SSE stuff, is that you're actually keeping state in the right place. So I think that's it's funny because Datastar is really just about making things pluggable, but the SSC thing is pretty powerful, and I think it's a superset, and it just has better defaults. But if you come from an HTMX world, it's very similar, but you have better defaults and you get more responsiveness out of the box, and you're doing less in your front end, ironically, than HTMX does.
Yeah. Sometimes we say with SSE, you can return 0 to n results. And I think people get focused on the n part,
Right.
obviously.
Yeah.
But
100%.
the 0 part, I think, is interesting too. You don't have to return anything, right? With HTMX, if you're swapping something into the DOM and nothing's changed, you still need to perform that swap, right? With
Yeah, you still do
SSE,
you do an HX post, but like you could get back an empty fragment. I mean, it's the same issue.
right? But what I'm saying is in HTMX, you cannot send back an empty fragment, right? Because you've
Oh, you
already
can?
said.
I thought you could.
I will need to look that up, but my
Okay.
assumption is you're saying, you've specified HX target, so you said whatever comes back,
Right.
swap it
No,
into
you're
this
right.
target. If
Yeah.
nothing comes back, I don't know what happens. Does it remove it? I don't know, but that feels like a non-deterministic thing. Whereas with SSE, we can have 0 responses. Nothing's changed, therefore I'm not going to send anything back, and no harm, no foul. Great. Let's talk about, because this came up recently. We were actually discussing this today in the Discord. We had a big discussion about it. Polling. This is something that you kind of puke in your mouth every time I mention it.
Yeah, hold on. I have
But
to
I
go
think
by
it's.
real quick. I just have to use the trash can. Hold on.
But let's talk about your approach, and then we'll talk about my approach, given our different backgrounds.
Yeah. So I'm giving it a hard time. Like I've done a ton of like the Meteor and the long polling and all this kind of stuff in the past, and then WebSockets. I embrace those heavily because I was like, I hate polling. The So here's the thing: is that everything that I do tends to be push based, and the reason why that is because I can wait till some event happens and then it gets pushed to someone that's subscribing, like a publish subscribe kind of situation, and then I can send down the new fragments or signals or whatever is going on, or I can say, hey, I'm going to debounce this and I'm going to put back pressure and I'm going to do all these kind of things. So I'm only not only am I only sending events, but I'm also doing filtering and mapping and all those kind of reactive things in the back end. I find that it's easier from a mental model because I have events streaming, tens of thousands a second kind of thing, and I can filter and do things and decide what's important for that connection. I think that that's actually a lot easier than trying to poll, because polling, you're constantly trying to recreate the entire world. And I know we talk about that from a fragment position of like recreate this fragment, but when you do polling, you're having to recreate the entire state of your backend. Whereas you already have state about that connection saying, hey, this person is already connected. They're interested in these things. Okay, send down those big chunks at a time. So that's the way I think about things, is that if you have push based, you're using less resources overall, because keeping an open connection is not resource intensive. We were talking about people. I tend to do 10,000 active live connections per core, and like work on 8-core systems. You can get 80,000 connections. That's not unreal on today's hardware. So that's actually cheaper because you're only sending data when you need to. And then because you're not polling all the time, now all of a sudden, even if you're sending a fat chunk, well, you're not only doing it when something changes. So
Right.
you decide when to do that. So you're sending way less data than someone that's constantly polling, even if they're grabbing literally just the indicator at the top of their screen. I'm sending these giant chunks and I'm using less data than they are.
So your answer to polling is don't do polling if you
Don't do
can.
it. Just
Yeah.
don't ever do it. But I live in a world where like green threads are easy. Everything's async. I have watchers and subscribers and all that. So my stuff tends to be a little more complicated from the beginning, starting place, but then it never gets harder. So
Mhm.
there's kind of a ramp there, and then it never gets harder. Whereas that's not the world a lot of people live in, Ben.
Yeah, I live in a different world. I live in a world of an elephant where asynchronous programming is possible, but it's not easy. And the PHP world has not really fully embraced it, right? So there are frameworks like there's Swool and there's React PHP, AMP PHP. All of these are frameworks to help make asynchronous programming easier. And they kind of, but you still have to understand event loops and coroutines. But applications in PHP are generally not set up for asynchronous programming. In traditional PHP, every request is like spins up a new process, a new thread. The application is bootstrapped from scratch all the way up. It handles the request, sends the response, and terminates. So you're done. So you basically have these very short-lived connections. And part of optimizing your application is reducing the number of processes and the amount of time that those requests need to take. So by saying let's just keep a long-lived request open, that's fine, but you're kind of going against the grain of how PHP and web servers work. And not to mention that you get memory leaks and you have to manage persistent state and all of these things, all of these problems, it gets complicated. So generally speaking, you open the connection, you close it as quickly as possible, and you're done. Hence, polling in PHP is much more common than in a language like Go, of course. So we've been talking about polling in terms of Datastar, and one of the things that I find interesting is that polling to I think to most people means you set an interval of like, let's say 10 seconds, and every 10 seconds your front end is just going to make a request to the back end. Now the back end doesn't have to do anything. We've already said that, right? Because you can make send zero events back.
204, I think it is. No content.
Yes, but there is no practical way in traditional polling of like stopping the polling, right? Besides, well, I guess you would have to set that up on the front end. And again, once again, you're now putting state on the front end and you're putting logic on the front end. What I find really interesting with the Datastar approach is that you have more control, or you actually have complete control over the polling process from the back end, because you're able to swap the fragment that has the data on interval with the timings, like the duration. I think I said 10 seconds a few moments ago. If you detect from the back end that something has changed, resources are freed up, or we're close to an event taking place, then you're able to swap the fragment in the DOM that says change this interval to be every 3 seconds, or change it to be every minute, or stop polling altogether. So I think it's, for me at least, it's kind of this revelationary thing of, oh, I can control polling that is initialized on the front end. I can control that from the back end. So I think that's a really interesting approach, and it gives me a whole new take on polling. If I have to do polling, which I most of the time do. I'll talk about when I don't in a moment. That's something that I would like to write a how-to guide. I think that would be a perfect use case for how to.
Well, the nice thing, that's more of a hypermedia approach, just so that people are clear. You could and you should do this if you're using HTMX. If you're currently in an HTMX project and you're not doing like what I call reactive polling, like that's just the way that I have done it in the past. If you're not doing that or long polling, I think you're doing it wrong. So this is not a Datastar specific thing or some kind of. We do have tools that make it so that literally you can do data on interval now, which I don't think you can really do in HTMX out of the box in the same way. But the point is that you have so much more control of this if you're backend focused. So even if you don't like Datastar and you hate us, at least do like a more reactive polling if you're gonna do it, please.
Right. Now, in saying that, there are cases where I think a long-lived SSE connection using PHP is appropriate. Like if you have a dashboard and I'm an authenticated user, I'm logged into the dashboard. Sure, I want to see things in real time. Why not? Like why would I set up 5-second polling? Because then I have a 5-second lag of anything that happens. The thing is that you probably only want to do that with authenticated users so that you can keep those number of connections to a reasonable limit. You don't want thousands of connections staying open for a longer duration.
Does it create a per thread, or it doesn't do any kind of green? It's a per thread, like per request, or how does that work? Okay, yeah, that's very much the old school Glassfish JVM style approach. Yeah, that does not scale super high, people, but it is better alternative, especially if the thing is, most people overcompensate. Like they think they're going to have to go to web scale or deal with huge amounts of messages. Some of us have those problems. Most people have 100 users, right? Like, so be realistic when it comes to a dashboard. You're not going to have tens of thousands of people. If you do, that's a good thing. Like, come talk to us. We'll help you like migrate away and make it a more efficient thing. The good thing is Datastar doesn't change in these situations, right? Like this is a backend problem. It has nothing to do with Datastar. We just expose it easily. Like you get back to your backend problems is what I say with Datastar. Like it just gets out of your way, but now you have your real problems to deal with. So
cool. Is there anything else we want to talk about?
I think the one thing that is really important, even when it comes to polling, like just because you will see that I have very strong opinions, right? Like that is anyone that deals with the Datastar at all knows that that's very much the case. But I am looking out for. We are interested in seeing other people use it for their situations. Like even in this situation of polling, I am very confident that you will have less code and it'll be more maintainable and it'll actually be putting less on the front end if you do it the Datastar way. Even if you're using HTMX today and you're doing polling, you may be like, I don't get it. But if you got in there and gave it a try, I really do think that you'll see that it's even simpler in that case, which is to us a counter example of how ideally you would do things. So like give it a try. Like a lot of times there's a lot of misconceptions of what Datastar is. And I think some of that comes from the fact that we're small enough that it doesn't seem like it should be possible that it's a full framework that can actually do all these things. So our size is both great, but also kind of a detriment because they think that like I have to make things complicated or I have to do all this stuff. I have to work around these limitations. And it's like, those aren't limitations. Those are there on purpose to stop you from recreating a spa. So that's something to just I want people to be aware of that. I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of porting a spa or porting even an HTMX example. Like it's easy to get trapped in a bad state. And I don't know. I think that's important.
Yeah, I think of Datastar as very much for the backend developer, and it doesn't mean that you need backend specific things. We have people in the community who are using all sorts of languages. We're up to 6 SDKs, by the way, and we just got a PR for a Rust SDK. Interestingly, so things are coming in all the time. It very much is backend agnostic, but you will be well served if you are knowledgeable in terms of working on the back end. Even that polling example, like you said, it will reduce the amount of code on the front end. And what I was saying is that it still gives you more control from the back end because you're able to kind of dictate how to deal with back pressure and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I think it's the perfect mix for back-end developers. For front-end heavy developers, maybe not. I don't know, but that's
it will be interesting going forward
themselves.
Yeah, to see how it acts. So, for example, like a lot of the kind of trends that people have been seeing in the front end lately is things like shed scene where it's like, hey, I can just drop in this table thing or a data table from Tanstack, and I just get a table and like I'm done. Like I don't have to think about it. Whereas we don't do any magic for you. Like if you want to do a data table with pagination and have sorting and all that stuff, that's a back end thing. Like you have to know how to build those kinds of things. Like so in some ways we aren't holding your hand, but it means that you have the ultimate power. And most people I think don't realize how easy those things are in the long run to actually do it yourself and to understand it. And it makes your code easier and more maintainable in the long run. So there's a kind of a trend towards these component things that just kind of do it for you. But in the long run, you're actually just making more spaghetti for yourself in more of an NPM hell. So we're trying to change that, but that also means that we're putting the onus on you more so than in the past.
Yeah, we've said it before, and I think we'll continue to say it. Like we're trying to take the magic out of the front end process. We're trying to give you the declarative tools to do things and to make things work. But Datastar very much embraces like understanding what's going on and driving things from the back end, but having the front end tools to bring that cohesiveness together.
Yeah, and that's the part that I'm most excited about is the long term. I think the community is going to be a really great resource for teaching people how to build backends. I don't think Datastar itself is that, but I think the community around it is going to be people that are really passionate about building up tools and building better versions of things. And I think there's going to be an upswell of better frameworks for doing this kind of stuff that are backend driven. Just because Datastar's not doing that for you, so per language, you're going to get better tools. Like I'm going to be working on my own data table thing in Go for doing Datastar, but it's going to be Go specific because it's a Go specific problem. So I think you'll see more and more of that, and maybe there's cross language versions of this out there. But yeah, I think the community overall, that's where the real value is going to be in the long term. 100%.
Yeah, and I think these how-to guides that I keep mentioning, they're going to focus on the Datastar aspect, right? Like I don't think we're teaching people how to build a data tables on the back end. That's not the point, right? You figure out how to do that part. We'll help you with the front end, which is very light anyway. The other thing you mentioned is web components, and it makes me think we should have one of these and discuss web components and how we can use them in Datastar. I think it's going to be its own topic, though.
Yeah, it's a good point.
I think we can wrap it up. I'm glad that you used the word onus correctly. Thank you. And
we had a whole discussion about this. You was saying onerous, and there's onus, but one's a noun and one's an adjective. So yes, I don't know how to word good me drug brain.
That's why we keep you locked in the basement working on the source code and
yes,
telling
luckily
people
it's very well lit in this basement. So thank goodness.
All right. See you next time.
All right. See you guys.